Yeah, it was surprising to us too, because I think we kind of had pigeonholed OpenAI as being a model provider. And I happen to know more about their plans that I shouldn't talk about here, but my hunch would be that in fact there's going to be increasing amounts of structure and logic and application building on top of the core OpenAI stuff. And then the question will be for companies like us and for LangChain and other open source projects, how much of that ends up being subsumed.
The following is a conversation with Matt Welsh, co-founder and CEO of Fixie.ai. Fixie is setting out to change how the world develops software using AI as a foundation. I had a great time talking with Matt about his opinion on the direction of the artificial intelligence community, as well as the underserved areas within the AI application stack. I hope you enjoy. Beautiful. Matt, thank you very much for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I tell you what, my goal for today is to dig into the business and the strategy side of Fixie and how you're thinking about the market, how you're approaching it, and it being a very hot topic right now. I know there's a lot of people who are going to want to know answers to these questions as well.
Yeah, I'm excited to chat with you about this. It is changing so fast. I was just speaking with one of my investors earlier today, and she said, "We haven't chatted in a week." That seems like a dog year or something like that in the span of time of how fast things are changing in the field.
Totally. Well, I tell you what, let's just start it off broad. And can you give me a quick overview of what Fixie is?
With Fixie, what we're looking to do is just make it really easy for companies to integrate large language models into their own applications. And like today, if you wanted to build an LLM based application, you have to deal with a lot of things. You've got the models, the prompts, fine tuning, interfaces between the models and external data sources, things like crawling and indexing, vector databases, and then of course all the like testing, quality evaluation, client integrations. And so it turns out that you have to build a pretty big stack if you want to do anything interesting. What we're trying to do is capture all of that into a very easy to use cloud-based service that you effectively as a developer just send queries in English, and Fixie deals with all the mechanics of the model and the prompting and the tokens and the vector database and so forth, and then gives you back the answer.
Cool. Fabulous. And so what does your ideal customer look like right now? Are they big? Are they small? SMB, enterprise?
Well, being an early stage startup, ideal, I would say any customer sounds good to us right now to some extent. But yeah, we're targeting enterprise customers primarily, where imagine like an insurance company or travel agency. And a lot of these companies are looking at how they can integrate language models into their own products. And many of them are just not going to be AI experts. They're not looking to be AI experts. They're also not looking to spend a lot of time building custom solutions. They need more of a turnkey solution. They're also not going to necessarily stay abreast of all of the latest developments in the AI space. If a new, paper comes out that talks about a better way of prompting the model to get a certain result, this is not what they want to be spending their time on. So the primary focus initially is on applications that involve building conversational agents that communicate both with static data that might live inside of the enterprise. So that might be, like a knowledge base or a set of documents on a website. And dynamic data that might be drawn from places like APIs or databases.
Do you see your ideal use cases initiated by a human and doing through a chat interface and going through there? Or is it more API based?
So Fixie as a product is really a platform. So we are an API surface, not a chatbot ourselves, but the ultimate system or product that someone builds with Fixie would likely be something that has a human typing at it somewhere. In the future, we do want to extend that to cover things that might be business process automations. New resume was submitted to our applicant tracking system, match it against potential job descriptions and rank them and then notify the appropriate recruiter or something like that. That would be more of an automated flow. It happens to use a language model under the covers, but there's no human actively typing into it and saying, please do this thing. But we're starting with conversational agents primarily because, first of all, the language model technology is in such a great place right now to cover a lot of those use cases. And also because there's just overwhelming demand for it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so then let's dig into the other side of that. So I know that agents are obviously a very large piece of Fixie's core product right now, and agent reliability hasn't been as great as some folks may wanted. How is Fixie tackling that problem?
I would say every company in this space is struggling with a lot of the same kind of problems around, how do you know that the agent is going to respond factually? How do you know that it's going to stay on topic? How do you know it's not going to start spouting, Middle English quotations or something when you're trying to get a answer about your order history? We have a few takes on that. I think the first thing is in the Fixie architecture, the agent is the building block, and an agent in our nomenclature really is an intermediary between the language model and some specific data source. So I might have an
Yeah.
agent that pulls data from a database or
Hmm.
agent that pulls data from this knowledge archive. And those agents are, by definition, fairly narrowly constrained in terms of what they are supposed to know about and what they're
Hmm.
supposed to respond with. That gives us the ability then to, put some guardrails on what that agent is able to do. And it makes it a lot easier to do testing and quality control as well. So that's the first step. I'd say the second step is you often need the language model to know when it doesn't know something.
Hmm.
And this can be hard because today, if you're naive about this and you ask a language model something that it doesn't actually know the data for, you say, what's the weather like in, and you make up a city name that doesn't exist, for example, it
Hmm.
will quite happily tell you what the weather is in that non-existent place. You need to give the model the ability to effectively introspect on its own knowledge.
Sure.
And that's also part of our architecture is the ability to augment the model's effectively reasoning ability with externalized facts that help it understand how it's making its decisions.
Mm.
And this is still in development. It's not fully there yet, but it's something that we think is going to be pretty important for solving some of that.
As you're building out these new primitives or you're coming up with new methods to do this, how do you balance open source software versus proprietary and you're building your own primitives or agents?
This has been a constant source of debate and discussion internally because, we're all on the team very much open source community people and community builders. I was involved in Linux way back in the late 90s. Zach and I on the team were both on the Chrome team and spent a lot of time contributing to open source there. So we want to open source a lot of things because we think that as a developer platform, it's really important to be in the open source community and building your core around an open source project. It's going to
Hmm.
be too hard for us as a small team to keep up with all the developments in the space independently. And so we need to have the help of the open source community, but also for our customers, they want to have, in many cases, the assurance that, they can pick up this stuff and not worry too much about whether it's a proprietary, vendor solution.
Sure.
So our plan right now is to effectively open source the core engine, the runtime that's inside Fixie that
Mm.
you should think of as kind of like LangChain in the sense that it is an orchestration layer. It's the way in which you build an agent and the runtime that that agent uses to do its work. But that's not the full cloud product. The cloud product involves, things like hosting, monitoring,
Sure.
observability, user identity management, all that kind of fun stuff. So we want to be in a place where people can build their own applications using the core logic of Fixie without necessarily using our cloud hosted version.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so then on the topic of agents and integrating with other data sources, which data sources are you excited for customers to start to integrate more with? Because the standard ones feel like the Salesforces, the HubSpots, but what are you personally excited about?
Well, all of those are still very much relevant. And I think,
Mhm.
we've seen plenty of useful integrations with those things already in LangChain, in Llama Index, and other open source libraries. And then now there's some new companies coming up that are effectively acting as gateways between the LLM world and the external API world. We see a ton of value just from things that are like on the public web, building a conversational agent around a company's documentation, for
Mhm.
example, or their
Mhm.
knowledge base. So it doesn't even need to be sophisticated to be really powerful and really useful. The other thing that we think is going to be important here is the ability for the agents to call into live data sources. So if I'm doing something in like a customer support workflow, I
Mhm.
need the ability to check the order history or look up the customer's, profile And a lot of those things tend to be very custom. They
Hmm.
tend not to be too standardized across our customers. And so they're going to need the ability to write some amount of custom code to act as that interface layer between the language model
Cool.
and their data source.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. And then what's Fixie's philosophy on LLM management? Who brings the model to the table?
Yeah, the way we're approaching that is we're model agnostic. We're
Sure.
saying, BYOM, bring your own model
Hmm.
if you want. We also provide backends that have, OpenAI's model and Anthropic's model and some other models behind the scenes. Some of the customers we've talked to, they've got their own model and they want to have a framework that they can use with that model without necessarily being tied to any one of the vendors. It's going to be an interesting question to see which way this goes. I mean, the open source is eating the lunch of the entire AI community memo
Yeah.
that just got leaked from Google yesterday. Kind of points at this where we see just this massive explosion of open source models on the horizon.
Uh-huh.
And we want to be well positioned to say, look, pick the best model for the job, for the particular agent that you want to build.
Sure.
And we're kind of agnostic about that.
Yeah, that's cool. So then, as a member of the open source community, or if you're speaking to developers and they want to enter their space and maybe they want to build on top of Fixie themselves, what's the best way for them to get started?
Yeah, right now you can go to Fixie.ai and we're in an open developer preview.
Hmm.
And the whole thing you can just go log in with a Google or a GitHub account. There's a bunch of documentation. There's some example code on GitHub. The SDK is open source.
Nice.
You can go and start building right now. We've tried to make the developer experience super slick. So we're getting ready to launch something today, actually, where you can take anything in LangChain
Hmm.
and basically go into the directory with your LangChain app and type Fixie deploy.
Hmm.
And it takes that, bundles it into a Fixie agent, pushes it to the cloud, stands it up, runs it, gives it a URL, and now
Cool.
you can build applications using that without having to do any additional steps.
That sounds super interesting. Moving over to the industry side of the house, and one of the topics folks always talk about is around moats and whether or not the startups that are coming around today have a moat in this AI space or not. What are your favorite types of moats that you think are most robust?
I tend to think that technical moats only buy you a little bit of time
Hmm.
these days, and I don't think relying upon saying we're going to have the better version of this, model or a better technique for prompting the model is going to get you very far. I think you're going to need to see for startup company, moats around frankly just the product itself, like just how good of a packaging you can do, how effectively can you pull in all those integration points,
Sure.
and then how rapidly can you become kind of a de facto standard? LangChain has been so tremendously popular and effective at getting there because it is the de facto standard way of doing this stuff, very much like, PyTorch or something in the
Sure.
ML training space. And so I think that forms a kind of moat because you say if you can be the de facto standard way of building, say, cloud hosted LLM applications, which is what we aim to be, then people are going to tend to gravitate towards that, even if there are better solutions out there.
Sure.
That's just sort of a natural thing to have happen if you've got a vibrant developer community.
Sure, sure, sure. And we spoke around agent reliability earlier. And so let's just say that agents are fully reliable today. What's the next act for them? And so what I mean to say by that is we've seen trends on the baby AGI and auto GPT side of the house,
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
those are pretty advanced use cases, but a lot of folks have said, hey, they're not reliable enough for me to go do what I need to do on them. Do you think that the trend will continue that way, or do you see another trend with agents once they become more reliable?
Yes, I think the idea behind AutoGPT and Baby AGI, many of those ideas have influenced the way that we build the runtime in Fixie. And so, one way of thinking about this is you don't actually need to go to full autonomy in the kind of AutoGPT sense in order to get a lot of the value out of this concept of the sort of self thought
Sure.
and the referencing a long term memory and understanding that I need to take some additional steps here. I need to explore a path, right? Because human thought is not linear, right? It's very much a branching process.
Hmm.
And I think that's one of the most important things about what AutoGPT has shown us is that these language models are good enough at following a branching logic process. So we're banking on that very much as being part of the solution. we think that the way to build agents that are reliable is you have to do that. It's not
Mm,
optional. It's not just a parlor trick. It's actually kind of core to it.
that is cool. And then moving on to the plugin world or the plugin environment. So it almost feels like plugins have died down a little bit since the release and everybody's been talking about it. But how do you think that plugin space is going to evolve? And I guess where I'm going with that is what percentage of companies do you think will be like giving docs to have people interact with their own plugins?
We really like ChatGPT plugins, and I actually built one the other day. It was took me like almost no time to hook one up into Fixie. It was really fun. They have a little bit died down. I don't think that's so much really a reflection on how good or how effective they are. I think it's a little bit of the go-to-market strategy that OpenAI happens to be using with them. But if they were to
Sure.
just open up the floodgates on them, there's risks of doing that, of course, that they may
Mhm.
not want to take, but I think the activity around that space would fire back up again. Um, the way we're kind of seeing things evolve here is, plugins do definitely solve a very important problem, which I'll call the last mile problem. It's that
Sure.
how do I bridge between the language model's abilities and some external system or API? And how do I automate the process of giving you an interface between those things? That's super cool. And we have a similar thing in Fixie. What it doesn't do by itself, though, is enable you to build processes or applications that actually use multiple of these things in some kind of workflow.
Sure.
And so if I wanted to build an application that said, for example, okay, we're pulling resumes from here, we're pulling the job descriptions from here, we're
Hmm.
pulling LinkedIn profile data from here, let's combine all that stuff together and use it in some meaningful workflow for, say, a recruiter,
Hmm.
that isn't exactly what you're able to do with plugins today, although, plugins can be a really important part of that solution.
Yeah. What's your hunch on OpenAI's philosophy on whether or not they want to try to enable workflow support? Because I was surprised I thought that they would have remained just on the foundational layer and just be the intelligence layer. So plugins was a little bit of a surprise to me. What's your philosophy on where they want to go?
Yeah, it was surprising to us too, because I think we kind of had pigeonholed OpenAI as being a model provider, and I happen to know more about their plans that I shouldn't talk about here, but my hunch would be that in fact there's going to be increasing amounts of structure and logic and application building on top of the core OpenAI stuff. And then the question will be for companies like us and for LangChain and other open source projects, how much of that ends up being subsumed
Sure.
versus how much value add can you build on top. One thing that we're definitely hearing talking to customers is that many of them are not able to use OpenAI for one reason or another, or they have
Mhm.
their own model, or they have concerns around data governance or privacy or regulations. And so having a model agnostic solution to that, I think, is going to be really important.
Yeah, that's cool. Next topic is around Zapier, who's been in the no code space for a really long time, and they have a ton of integrations, and they're really good at integrating to other companies there. What's your take on how the industry will evolve with companies like Fixie and with the plugin mindset with companies like Zapier, who have traditionally been good at credential management?
There's a couple of ways this could play itself out. We love Zapier, and I actually built a Fixie Zapier integration the other day, just as a way of seeing how that would work, and it turned out to
Hmm.
be just so easy and like incredibly useful. So, for example, if I wanted to build a Slack bot or a Discord bot that talks to Fixie, there's a lot of steps you could go through to do that, or you can just use Zapier as the
Sure.
as
Uh-huh.
the intermediary, and it's great. I love it. It works so well. So one way that this might play itself out is Zapier acting as the sort of lower level integration points, and I think they
Hmm.
do an excellent job at that. There's no reason to go build your own if you can use that kind of stuff directly. Currently, Zapier, of course, definitely is limited. It's not designed around an LLM first way of doing things, but I could imagine Zapier investing time into that area. It would make a lot of sense for them to boost that. I also think Zapier is very well suited for the kind of no code business automation.
Hmm.
And they have an excellent product for that. That's not exactly what Fixie's trying to build. We're not trying to be a business no code automation tool, but my expectation is that you'll have multiple companies at different levels of this stack, right? And
Sure.
where, Zapier might be way up here and LangChain's like way down here, and we're kind of somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, that's cool. And then moving over to the storage space. So Pinecone getting 100 million was big news in the industry. What's your take on that one? And two, what's your take on the storage space in general?
This is an interesting one. I don't know how this one's going to evolve personally. I do think the vector databases are tremendously important. Everybody needs one today. They're becoming kind of part of the core stack.
Hmm.
I saw something recently where you can just plug in vector database support to Postgres and it's open source. So there ends up being a question at some point whether just having the database capability is a kind of a defensible enough place to be. One thing that I saw recently is I think maybe it was Pinecone put out, as a blog post saying, here's how to use Pinecone along with OpenAI and LangChain and three other tools in order to build this whole thing. And it was like 18 steps,
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
and of course it is. That's not, it's not a ding on Pinecone. It's just, in order to pull all those things together, that's what you have to do. So that kind of is our, validating our hypothesis that there's going to be plenty of people that don't want to go through pulling all these different things together into their own solution. They just want to build
Sure.
something in a much higher level abstraction.
Do you think that databases like that will try to verticalize with other workflows that surround the database management, such as document ingesting and the embedding in the first place?
It's a great question. Historically, that's not been a successful business model for companies that are operating at that kind of infrastructure layer. There have been database vendors that have done some of that, but I don't tend to think that that ends up being the winning business strategy, mainly because you do want to have a horizontal platform that lots and lots and lots of things can be built up on top of. Also, I tend to think that some of the use cases of a vector database with things like document ingestion and adapting to different API surfaces, that ends up being commoditized at some point. It's not something that I would expect to be a differentiator for a vector database company. It is
Uh-huh.
today
Uh-huh.
because it's not as well established, but I see that very rapidly becoming a thing that there's a half a dozen open source libraries that'll do that. I don't need to go and look for a vendored solution.
It goes back to your technology won't be a moat for very long statement.
I tend to think that's right, and so it makes, if I were Pinecone, I'd definitely be investing in that, but recognizing that that's sort of a short term,
Sure.
growth hack.
Sure. And as you were talking about the core AI stack earlier and what's emerging on it, which part of the stack do you think is still underdeveloped and needs more attention?
Absolutely anything having to do with testing, quality, reliability, evaluation.
Hmm.
I was speaking just recently with someone who's a solutions architect, and they spend a lot of time building solutions for customers that integrate things like LangChain and Llama Index and so forth. And I was asking, how do you go about evaluating the quality and efficacy of these things? How do you ensure safety? And this guy's an expert. He's been doing this for a while, and he kind of threw up his hands and said, "We don't have a good answer to this."
Yeah.
And I worry a bit that the excitement around this whole space, we will start to hit a brick wall in the industry if people are not investing into this. It's going to have to get so much more robust and more methodical than it has been.
Hmm.
So I would love to see companies building out tooling and infrastructure and mechanisms for doing that kind of testing and safety and quality evaluation.
Yeah, that's interesting. I want to understand what needs to happen in order for Fixie to succeed. And so, what trends need to continue, or what bets are you making that need to play out for Fixie to be able to succeed?
That there's really two things. I think the first thing is that we are betting on an LLM maximalist future
Hmm.
in which the LLMs become so powerful and so ubiquitous that they are just everywhere and they are so capable of doing so many different things. Today, of course, we have challenges, hallucinations,
Sure,
and
sure, sure.
latency and cost and being closed. But I just believe for Fixie to be successful, we are going to have to be in that future where this stuff is just 100 times better than it is today. And I actually believe that will be the case.
Okay.
I'd say the second thing really is we need to be in a world in which people learn how to program with LLMs as a core building block. It's not just a little library or something that's off to the side.
Mm.
It kind of starts to replace a lot of the core business logic that people have developed to date. And the question will be how that transition happens. And it
Yeah.
reminds me a little bit of the difference between pre-cloud and cloud, that once the cloud started to transition, a lot of stuff that people were building and had to maintain started to go away because they could just shift it to the cloud.
Yeah, absolutely. And then to wrap us up with our last question here, what's something controversial about this space that you believe that others may not?
Well, I think, maybe my hot take, controversial opinion, it may not be that controversial, but for me, it's all about the fact that these language models have this tremendous potential to render software development obsolete. I think we're going to see a future in which people are not writing programs. They're going
Hmm.
to be using the language model. They're going to be teaching the language model how to do things, and that will be in fact the program. So the model is the computer,
Sure.
is one way of thinking about that. And people are starting to see the beginnings of that. ChatGPT is really good at writing code, but
Hmm.
at some point you don't even need to write the code. Why have Python at all if I can tell the model what I want in English, just have it do the work right here and now. So I think that's my belief about where all of this is ultimately going. The question is that going to happen in 2 years, 5 years, or 10 years?
Sure, sure, sure.
But even if it's 10 years, I think a lot of people who are entering the field today are going to be seeing a very different field during their careers.
So then if people don't need to write code anymore, will they still need to architect programs, or do you think that'll be offloaded too?
It's a good question. And I think, my biggest kind of question around that is a lot of the ways we think about architecting software is done so that other humans can understand it and maintain it. And if that ends up going away, then the concept of software architecture might start to look a little antiquated. And so, it's kind of like if you think about the old typesetting machines that, use, a lot of machinery and parts in order to make metal type. And certainly there was lots of innovations in making those things work more reliably. But the moment that you switch to electronic typesetting on computers, all of that technology just became irrelevant overnight. So
Sure.
that is the question in my mind. I don't have a great answer for it, but we may be looking at a future where the idea of a program or a piece of software is an inscrutable black box with an LLM inside of it.
I want to pull on it just a little further. So if the valuable skill for one to have to build software today is to be able to write software and they don't need to architect anymore, what's the skill that people are going to need in order to build things that provide value?
I think it's going to have to be much more around thinking about product, thinking about, what is the problem you're trying to solve for whom and why, less about how it's implemented and more about the thoughtfulness around how it operates and what it's meant to do. That's still very important today, of course, but I think
Hmm.
today we kind of have a two-tier system where we kind of rely on the product experts to think about the product, and then the engineers just write the code that they've been told to write roughly.
Uh-huh, yeah.
In the future, we may find less of this happening at the bottom, and a lot more needs to be about how to build thoughtful products.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, Matt, how can people get a hold of you if they want to get in contact?
Well, we're at fixie.ai, Fixie.ai, and you can email me at matt@fixie.ai. I'm also MD Welsh at Twitter, and you can just reach out to me anywhere you can find me.
Fabulous. Matt, well, thank you very much for joining me today and having a conversation.